It's been almost a century since the US declared war on Germany. But why did we join World War I in the first place? It might seem like a straightforward answer, but trying to do so leads us straight down the rabbit hole to the formation of the modern conspiracy theory movement. Hey, Cypher here, and yes, you heard correctly. Me, the person who has consistently told you guys I do not indulge conspiracy-minded folks, I'm gonna be going kind of into conspiracy theorizing on this one. So don your tinfoil hats. I finally get to show you the reason why I have this book sitting on my bookshelf all the time. Because this one has to do with some subjects that I've only hinted at in the past. This is going to be a wild subject, because in the process of this, we're going to be going over some wars you've never heard of to try to get at the causes of World War I in America. And of course, the best part about the subject is I get to do some Wilson bashing in the middle of it. You guys might be starting to understand why I dislike the guy so much. So stick with me, because we've got a lot to cover on this one.
World War I as a whole is difficult to comprehend why it began. We typically think of it as beginning with the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand, and the subsequent escalation of forces during the Guns of August in 1914. So called because of the excellent book about the steps in that escalation that at any point could have averted the war. What this narrative forgets is the Balkan Wars that precipitated the whole trouble with Ferdinand in the first place. There were two wars in the Balkans in 1912 and 1913. They were part of a number of independence movements that had made several Balkan states out of former Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman Empire lands. These wars were difficult to contain, and Russia almost got involved. But major European war was averted for the first two Balkan Wars by reinforcing pre-existing secret alliances between the Triple Entente and Central Powers rather than breaking them. The Third Balkan War, on the other hand, broke these cross-crossing alliances, and that is why we call it World War I. If you forget the Balkan Wars, then the whole narrative about nationalism and secret alliances falls apart. You don't see the deeper meaning of the assassination if you see it in isolation. The assassination only happened 10 months after the end of the Second Balkan War, and was perpetrated by a secret group of Serbian nationalists who wished to continue the gains Serbia made during that war. Their assassination certainly got the international attention they wanted, but it blew up into the Guns of August, breaking the alliances that had held back the tidal wave of European war since the 1870s. So you see, the main themes here are nationalism, secret alliances, and local conflicts escalating into larger ones. When Otto von Bismarck had created Germany in 1871 and the Peace of Europe, he had declared that the Balkans were, quote, the powder keg of Europe, and his prophetic vision came true and resulted in World War I. But what about the United States of America? Throughout all of this, the US had remained officially neutral. They did not join World War I at its start in July of 1914, not intervening until the spring of 1917, which means the US was out of the war for its majority. Many nations began as isolationists and eventually chose a side to join, but they all had a side that they collectively preferred, and the US was no exception. Woodrow Wilson was president the entire time, and he allowed arms to be sold to either side, but that quickly came to favor the Entente powers, due to existing business ties and the fact that the British were beginning to blockade the Central Alliance. Propaganda from the British flooded into US newspapers, speaking of the rape of Belgium, where German forces committed some atrocities during their invasion of Belgium that the British subsequently overbloated. They got another propaganda win when the Germans decided to use unrestricted submarine warfare the following year. A U-boat sank the RMS Lusitania in May of 1915, which happened to be carrying 128 American passengers on board the supposedly peaceful ocean liner. People freaked out in the US, and public opinion was clearly against Germany from then on, because, after all, it was reported that the ocean liner was a peaceful cruise. Secretly, it had been carrying arms and munitions bound for Britain, but the propaganda did its job well. Despite this, public opinion was still isolationist. World War I was a bloody affair, one of the worst in human history, but Americans did not want to take part in the carnage.
I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. I brought him up to be my pride and joy. Who dares to place a musket on his shoulder to shoot some other mother's darling boy? Let nations arbitrate their future trouble. It's time to lay the sword and gun away. There'd be no war today if mothers all would say, I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier.
Many campaigned for isolation. Henry Ford even tried to sail a chartered ship around Europe campaigning for them to stop fighting. By the time the presidential election took place in November of 1916, people were claiming that Woodrow Wilson had, as his campaign slogan went, kept us out of the war. His Republican opponent was too middle of the road, and with Wilson's promises to keep the US out of World War I, people voted for him, though it was a close race. Too bad Wilson had been undermining himself from the very beginning. Wilson had secretly lifted sanctions on loaning money to nations at war in 1915 after the sinking of the Lusitania, and the disparity in preference for which side of the war could be seen immediately when less than a 50th of the loan money to the Entente powers was loaned to the Central Alliance. Essentially, Wilson had co-opted big business to drive public interest into joining World War I before he was ever running for re-election. Whether it was intentional remains to be shown by historians and is a point of hot debate. But there is an even more insidious part to all of this that involves a lot of killing that has repercussions to this day. And yeah, that means some American small wars, a subject I'm kinda passionate about. The US and Germany had been competing imperial interests for some time before this, sometimes violently. In 1887, they had supported different factions in the islands of Samoa during their first civil war. This was essentially a proxy war, although there were German and American Marines on the ground fighting each other as well as against the opposing Samoan factions. But it began to escalate. 3 ships from both sides faced off against each other for over a year, circling around the islands and even sporadically shooting at each other. Eventually, in 1889, all the ships were either sunk or grounded, resulting in many lives lost. They decided on a new king of Samoa together, and peace was made until 1898, when another civil war broke out. It was fought by proxy again with little direct involvement from foreign Marines, but the Germans were forced to take a smaller section of the islands for their empire. There was political maneuvering for decades. Germany began to start making inroads for possible trade deals with countries in Latin America. Due to the Roosevelt corollary policy as an executive addendum to the Monroe Doctrine, otherwise known as speak softly and carry a big stick, under the progressive Republican presidents, Germany was kept at bay. But Wilson was a Democrat with a poor understanding of international affairs, despite being a historian. The US had already begun to get more interventionist with minor interventions, but Wilson took that to a wholly new level. Whereas Roosevelt and Taft had preferred short interventions like most of US history, Wilson turned these into slogs, much akin to what had happened in the Philippines in 1899 to 1914. In 1914, after the revolutionary government in Mexico had begun to oust American capital interests from the country, the US Navy was sent to keep tensions down. This backfired in the town of Tampico, where a minor scuffle caused Wilson to deny the Mexican government any sovereignty in its own affairs, refusing to recognize those in power. German citizens took advantage of the situation to get favor from the local government in Veracruz. Supposedly, they had curried favor by bargaining for arms shipments. Mere months before the Guns of August, Germany actually sent a ship full of armament towards Mexico. This violated an arms embargo Wilson had set for the entirety of Mexico months prior. So Wilson ordered the Navy to occupy the entire state of Veracruz. This occupation lasted for 7 months and took hundreds of Mexican lives. The dumbest part of this carnage was that the German ship just diverted to another Mexican harbor and unloaded its cargo anyways. As any Mexican viewer of my channel will readily tell you, they're still resentful about this, let alone when Pancho Villa began raiding across the US border a couple years later. Then there was Haiti in 1915. They had already had some serious problems asserting their power over German ambassadors back in 1897, so Wilson was worried about the fact that Germans were a high proportion of commerce there. A trade war had been brewing there between American and German interests for decades. After some local political upheaval there, Wilson decided to intervene for the sake of American interests. A quick rebellion was squashed, and the US held control of the country. Wilson refused to give up the power over that country, and forced the Marines to occupy the place for the rest of his presidency. We didn't leave Haiti alone until 1934. All out of fear of German business interests taking over. It's one of our longest wars, and no one seems to notice that we did this. The Germans began to sabotage US munition dumps in 1916. One shipyard was completely destroyed, and a different explosion caused some damage to the Statue of Liberty herself. This was all in an effort to stop the flow of munitions to the Entente powers. But of course, all it really did was anger the US. So America was already trying to fight off German influence in 1917, some of which would outlast World War I. Finally, we get to the final straw that Wilson used to bring the US into World War I, the Zimmermann telegram. You see, there had been conflict on the border between the US and Mexico since the Mexican Revolution began in 1910. I talked about it in this episode. At some point, the German government sent advisors to the border conflict. We know because two of them were killed in 1918 during the Battle of both Nogales. As a result of that battle, the beginning of the US-Mexico border fence began to be constructed. Seriously, Trump has this obscure battle to thank for his vision of a wall. Anyways, the German government tried to ask the Mexican government to join into World War I on Germany's side and fight against the US to regain the lands that had been lost because of the Mexican-American War of 1846-48. Mexico didn't respond, but the telegram had been intercepted by the British anyways and given to the US. The Brits were always quite eager to give anything to the US that might make the public resentful of Germany. As if Germany conspiring to make Mexico invade America wasn't enough, the telegram also revealed why they were doing it, and that was worse. Germany planned to begin unrestricted submarine warfare again, and needed all the allies they could get. Well, they sealed their doom in doing so. Before that warfare was implemented again, the US declared war on Germany.
Over there, spread the word over there, that the Yanks are coming, the drums coming everywhere.
That would seem to be enough, right? Escalating tensions over small wars in Latin America and the South Pacific caused enough animosity to declare war after a new U-boat offensive is discovered. It's simple. You can pack it up neatly. World War I in a box. Go in and get 'em. Have fun killing some krauts, and America saves the day again.
Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your...
Well, no one was satisfied with that explanation. People were saying the Zimmermann telegram was a forgery, or that the Germans would never follow through. They pointed out that business interests had been pushing public opinion towards the Entente powers, and that Wilson had abused his executive privilege to get them there. Some brought up the small wars that led to World War I. Some senators even tried to filibuster the declaration of war. It was not popular to begin with, and people didn't believe the reasoning behind joining. Wilson, despicable as he always was, silenced such resentment with the Sedition Act of 1918, which was perhaps the worst violation of the First Amendment in American history. Some who were critical of the war were jailed for speaking out. Lynchings kept others silent. This state continued well after the war. That doesn't mean that people stopped questioning the reason for World War I. By 1921, people were publishing books and pamphlets denouncing Wilson as having perpetrated a conspiracy to bring the US into World War I. This kept picking up steam throughout the 1920s. After the government had alleged such conspiracies of the communists during the 1919 Red Scare, how could they argue against their own sponsored conspiracy theorizing? People really liked the idea that Wilson had conspired to bring the US into World War I. It became as common an idea as people disbelieving that Kennedy was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. There had been conspiracy theorists before World War I, but they hadn't tried to say that the US government itself was the one conspiring against people. Before World War I, that was unthinkable. You see, Wilson used the war to expand executive power and the overall size of government. He usurped constitutional limitations in the name of keeping America safe, and then let them continue into 1919. Big government was a creation of World War I, and so distrust of the narrative fostered by that government was now a possibility. The first conspiracy theories with government as the villain was aimed squarely at Woodrow Wilson. A big incident led to the most important book in the World War I conspiracy theorists' doctrine. Smedley Butler, the Marine Corps general who had participated in a number of these spurious Wilson small wars, was a famous hero. In 1933, he was supposedly asked to help with a fascist coup d'etat to depose President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and become the new fascist leader of America,
which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship.
It is called the business plot. Butler told Congress about this, who never really investigated it. Butler had witnessed the violent dissolution by the U.S. Army of the Bonus March, a veterans movement for early pensions during the Great Depression that took over the mall in Washington, D.C. for a little while.
This is the greatest demonstration of Americanism we've ever had.
But was violently repressed, even bringing tanks down to stop it. So Butler decided to write a book. The book, quite obviously labeled War is a Racket, was released in 1934, and it spurred on a congressional investigation into the causes of World War I, called the Nye Committee. They were the ones that revealed that U.S. moneylenders had disproportionately favored the Entente powers, but nothing more sinister than that. Just to make this whole conspiracy theory stuff continue though, a prominent part of the Nye Committee was a man named Alger Hiss. He was later accused of being a prominent Soviet spy, perpetuating the conspiracy mythos for more to poke holes in every little detail. There is kind of a genealogy to conspiracy theorizing, and its genesis is World War I. So what do you think? Did the US join World War I as part of a vast conspiracy, the bumbling of an inept president, or the gradual buildup of tensions between the US and Germany? If you're interested, there are some books in the description you can check out, if you want a research hole to dig. But before you go, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.
Oh, how I hate to get up in the morning. Oh, how I'd love to remain in bed. For the hardest blow of all is to hear the bugler call. You've got to get up, you've got to get up, you've got to get up this morning. Someday I'm going to murder the bugler. Someday they're going to find him dead. I'll amputate his reveille and step upon it heavily and spend the rest of my life in bed.